I did already set multiple screen shares. So if you'd like to share slides, you can. If not, I can share them and you can just kind of direct me through as you present.
I should be
But
able to do this here.
I think everyone here is hopefully familiar with Dr. Yarnell. I'll just give him a brief intro, just in case you're not. Dr. Yarnell graduated from Bastyr in 1996 and has been in practice ever since. He's former chair of botanical medicine at SCNM, now SUNM, and was a full-time professor at Bastyr when he switched to adjunct teaching. He's president of Heron Botanicals, which some of you may have seen some of those products in lab, and chief science officer and co-founder of Red Root Pharmaceuticals, and chief creativity officer at Wild Brilliance Press. He practices part-time in Woodinville and Sebastopol. Dr. Yarnell is very interested in the ability of herbs to help prevent and treat diseases of the urinary tract and kidneys. He's particularly interested in understanding the synergy between the many constituents found in whole herbs compared to isolated constituents. And as you'll learn today, also talking about endangered herbs and proper use of them. So without further ado, I'll pass it on over to Dr. Yarnell.
Is the screen sharing?
Yes, we can see your screen.
Okay, weird. It's saying it's paused on my end. Yes, thank you for having me. And just to clarify that my other company is called Red Root Pharmaceuticals. And yes, I am trying to get an herbal formula approved by the FDA. Boy, I do not recommend trying this. It's insane. It's been just a mess, but I'm going for it. I'm not giving up. I will not be defeated. But endangered herbs. So this can be really hard not to cry and yell and scream about this. I'm so upset. So I originally, as far as I can track back, I gave the first lecture at a conference about this in 2009, and literally, it's only gotten worse. Like there has been no improvement. There's been no movement of any kind that I can tell to deal with any of these problems, except to make them worse. So this is going to be a story that's very tragic and horrible. And I don't know. So yeah, I was right from the beginning. Like, okay, what am I going to do? How am I going to fix this? I talking till I'm blue in the face, like that isn't working. So I have to figure out what action to take. And I figured out the perfect action, which is I'm gonna formally write to the Bastyr, both Bastyr clinic dispensaries, and say, you need to stop selling endangered herbs. Here's the list. You need to remove all products. And if you don't, I'm going to take further action. I'm going to organize the students. Like, I'm going to get these herbs out of our dispensaries. That's the very least I can do. Because it's disgusting. We're selling these things, we're completely complicit. And I work for a company or a school that's doing this every day. Like, I can't sleep with that. Like, that's not acceptable. So I'm going to do it. I'll probably fail, but anyway, we'll be marching in the streets. And that's just a tiny, tiny percentage of the problem. Anyway, there are lots of reasons that herbs are under threat. And some of these are really big, right? And it's really personal. Like when we talk about the climate catastrophe, this is a really direct way that it's affecting us and then what our future practice might be. There's no question that all kinds of herbs are being affected. So they've shown, like the flowering periods of plants are starting to dramatically change. They're starting much earlier because believe it or not, the winters are shorter. In the Northwest, at least, it seems like this has been a really long, prolonged winter. But we're also seeing that plants are starting to grow at higher altitudes than they used to because it's too hot lower down there. The cool band is moving up the mountains. But that is compounded by all sorts of more direct effects on the plants in terms of overharvesting, which is surprisingly not the main issue at all. I thought going into researching more of this that was going to be a huge driver, but most of the problems aren't from people harvesting too much. There are exceptions to that. We're going to talk about a couple, and that maybe plays some role, but the much bigger problems are loss of habitat, the climate catastrophe, wars, poverty, like these other major issues that we can't fix as practitioners, right? We can't get rid of war and poverty and things. We like that's going to require political activity beyond the clinical. So, but yeah, there's a lot of issues, and this
Dr.
is not
Yarnell,
new. Yeah,
if I
please,
can
please.
pause you really quickly, I don't think we're seeing the change in your slides. We're still looking at
Okay.
your uh,
So why
first
is it
slide.
doing that? Okay, did that do anything?
No.
Okay. All right, give me a minute to change something here.
Sure.
I'm going to stop this. We're going to, I think it's because it's Keynote. It never seems to play well with Zoom. So I'm going to make it into a PowerPoint. Also, I think I accidentally used an animated background. I don't think it likes that. Luckily, this is easy to fix. Okay, so now let's share again. Okay, let me close this. And I'll try it in PowerPoint here. Okay, so let's share again. Oh, technology. Okay, let's see if this works. Okay, is that advancing?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry about that.
Now we see that Ferula
Yeah,
estimate
here's
the threats. Yeah.
great. So anyway, yeah, that's just a list that I went over. So, okay, so I wanted to start off with the fact that this has been going on a long time. It's just accelerating. Um, and so this plant, we actually we don't know for sure what plant it was. So this is a plant that went extinct in ancient times. So before systematic botany, it was called Silphion or Silphium in Greek or Latin. We're pretty sure because we actually have images of it on coins, which I'll talk about in a minute, that it's this Ferula species. So this went extinct, I don't know, best guess is around the year 100 of the current era, so a long time ago. And that this was clearly driven by over harvesting. But so this is to say, like, yeah, human activity can have a dramatic impact on medicinal plants even before there was industrialization. So um, they had been harvesting this plant, which here's one of these coins that I mentioned showing it. So this is really clearly an Apiaceae because you can see those sheathing leaf bases. It's so classic. And also these ridges on the stem are just totally classic for the Apiaceae family. And kind of the inflorescence looks a little bit like an umbel. That's harder to, you have to a little bit imagine that. Um, so anyway, people from Greece moved to the coast of Libya starting, as you can see, around 630 BCE. So, depending on which account you look at it, there's a little bit of variation. And they really started to increase the harvesting and selling of this herb. So, that's partly because it was both regarded as a contraceptive and an aphrodisiac, which if there are two more conflicting actions for an herb to have, that's an interesting one. But anyway, it was really popular. The both of those things were stuff people really wanted. Oh, and also they were using the resin, like the way it's described, it was really clearly a resin, which there's for other ferula species in North Africa in the Apiaceae that have a resin, like all those features kind of match. And with these pictures on these coins, we're pretty sure this is what it was. Anyway, they harvested so much that eventually it went extinct. Like before they kind of realized this was the trajectory, it was gone. So it is believed to be the first recorded extinction. Like we know it existed, that it was popular, and then it's gone, and no one knows that this plant still exists. So yeah, so that's a big tale right there. Like the first known extinction was a medicinal plant. That's terrifying. And it's still continuing with other things. So um it we have this natural tendency to abuse our resources, right? To think it's unlimited. It seems like it, right? We have no conception of how much of a resource really is there. And it's just easy to say, well, everyone else is using it. There must be plenty, right? And that's not the case. So let's look at the interesting story of American ginseng, Panax quinquefolia. So just kind of starting off with our more American plants to really dive into this. And then we're going to talk about some others from around the world. But this is another one where we have evidence from the eclectics, like as you're going to see, that they talk about this being over harvested. Like there was already an awareness by the 1800s that this was an issue and that there wasn't an unlimited resource. So here's a picture from Jim Duke's garden. And, so here we have from 1898, King's American Dispensatory, Felter and Lloyd, right? Ginseng is becoming very scarce. And unless a method of cultivation becomes practical, bids fair to be exterminated. Hey, I love how they wrote back then. Like, why don't we say stuff like that anymore? Oh man, they were so much more poetic. So they were aware in 1898 that American ginseng was in serious trouble. And more modern research is really showing this. So this was an interesting study where they looked at herbariums. So they've all across where ginseng grows, they have samples, and they can see that there's fewer and fewer herbaria samples over time. Now, part of that is there's less collecting, but they controlled for that by various means. You can read this paper. Anyway, there's many, many lines of evidence showing a steady decline in wild American ginseng. So this got bad enough that, as we're going to see, there was added to an international treaty to help control how much is harvested. So yeah, clearly this one is mainly threatened by overharvesting, but there is habitat loss. This grows in deciduous forests in the east. That's where the large majority of the US population lives. So a lot of those forests have been lost. They've been converted to agriculture, they've been converted to cities, roads, all those things are a really big problem. Mining, of course, is also a big problem. This is one of our Appalachian plants, and coal mining has just had a devastating effect on all the plants, all of nature in Appalachia. So yeah, it's true we want to stop using coal because of the climate catastrophe, but I also always say, what about the absolute devastation of nature? Like extracting coal is incredibly devastating to the environment. Extracting oil is incredibly devastating. That's all the more reason to leave it in the ground, Anyway, the really big change came when American ginseng was introduced to China. So, of course, Asian ginseng was already, pretty arguably the most revered plant. And when they found out there was another one that had different properties but similar, oh, the demand went through the roof. And so there was a massive, massive harvesting to ship it overseas. So that still continues today. It's not as extreme, but this, had a drastic effect. And ginsengs are slow growing. It takes years for them to reach maturity. So it's not like you can just harvest out a whole bunch and then they're going to set what's left to make seeds and there's a new population of the same size next year. Like, no, that is not what happens. And we're going to see there's some other impacts. So this got so bad that in 1975, this treaty was created, which is called the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species. So most countries in the world signed on to this. And this Appendix 2 is the list of herbs. So there's Appendix 1, which is basically like, you cannot sell these herbs. They are so endangered. They're absolutely forbidden to export them, to import them. You cannot do it. We all agree, all these countries, we're not going to do that. Okay, but Appendix 2 are the herbs where it's like you can sell them, you can import or export them, but it has to be regulated. So your government has to set up a mechanism to track how much is being harvested, and there has to be limits to protect the wild populations. So Panax quinquefolius was on that list from the day the convention started because it was so obviously a problem. Now there is cultivation of American ginseng. That is part of the solution, but they are not doing a great job of mimicking the wild conditions, right? It's monocropping, and they use tons of chemicals to do that for the most part, because when you monocrop ginseng, it gets all kinds of fungal infections. Like the soil is not right in that it needs a mixed deciduous forest to be healthy, and that's not what's happening. They grow it under shade cloth in rows without all the other plants and the right soil microbes. So they have to use tons of chemicals. So that's kind of part of the solution, but also that's gross, right? Like, is that really the best choice? All states where ginseng grows have set up all kinds of regulations. So every state where ginseng grows, there's a season when it's legal to harvest, and that's different between different states. So if you're ever going to harvest ginseng, you have to research the laws, right? They've also increasingly imposed other restrictions because we now know how to do this right. If you're going to harvest ginseng, the most important thing is you wait until after it has set fruit. Because if you dig it up before the fruit sets, you're not going to get any baby ginsengs, right? We even know the best thing is to actually take the ripe fruit and plant it, right? So then you dig up, but you've just made next decades worth of new plants by doing that. So there's plenty of good actors. There are plenty of wildcrafters who are aware of this, who do it right. But there's so much money to be made. It's still as easily you can get $100 or $200 a pound for American ginseng. That's really good money. That there's huge incentives for people to break these rules. So, for example, they'll harvest in national parks, which is completely illegal. They'll harvest outside the season. They'll do it before fruiting. So those people are causing serious harm. But there's greater and greater awareness by people that are living in Appalachia that this is their living, it's part of their culture, how to do it right. And really, it's from traditional practices that have just been confirmed by research. It's not like it's some giant change. And so there's plenty of people who are harvesting American ginseng who are protecting it. So another myth is that wildcrafting is always destructive, and that's not true. And Sunshine, Dr. Weeks can attest to this when, Willie Pink, who's an indigenous man from Southern California, talks about this a lot. And he was talking about it in our Southwest Herb Experience class, that actually a lot of plant populations depend on humans to take care of them, to manage those stands, not monocropping them, but making sure they're protected and only harvesting reasonable amounts. And so there's lots of examples where wildcrafting can actually increase wild populations when it's done properly. So another trick for the sang harvesters is they want to hide where the ginseng is, right? They don't want other people to come and steal their ginseng. So one thing they'll do is they'll harvest the root and basically clip off the fruit, and that's fine. You just plant it, right? So no one knows you were there or they can't see it. but you've still created this great resource. So the main problem right now is these harvest seasons are now quite illogical. Because the climate catastrophe has shifted the fruiting period for ginseng, but also it shouldn't be based on dates. It should be based on what's happening with the plant. It basically should be the harvest only happens after the fruit have set. That should be the harvest season, not some arbitrary calendar date, which may or may not correlate. So that needs to get fixed in the laws. So here's another crazy thing they found out about what's happening to American ginseng, which is we killed the wolves, right? We basically eradicated wolves from the eastern United States. And what happened is the deer population exploded. There are actually way more deer in North America now than, as far as we can tell from any records, than there ever were. We don't know about before colonization started, but certainly since then, there's huge amounts. Well, these deer actually eat the ginseng. They eat the flowers and the leaves. And so they've been kind of steadily preventing American ginseng from going to fruit. So they've done a bunch of studies of what happens when you control the deer. And what happens is the wild ginseng populations improve. So some deer is fine. It's just when there's too many. So one of these studies, there was this fascinating thing of when in areas where they reintroduced wolves, car crashes with deer went down quite substantially because there's fewer deer, right? There's a more reasonable. So we can reduce car crash fatalities by having more wolves. Who would have ever seen that coming? Anyway, as I mentioned, coal mining has also been very, very detrimental to wild ginseng. The climate catastrophe is bad. So there's lots of factors. And the weird thing is, if we're not going to bring back wolves, the alternative is that humans need to replace that role. We need to be the predators. But hunting is also really in decline, quite dramatically. So there's no predator for the deer. We've gotten rid of them and we're not taking that role. So, and I'm not like big into hunting or anything. I'm just saying ecosystems need predators. They absolutely depend on them. And if there is no predator, then it gets out of balance. And so if we're not going to let the wolves do their job, we have to do the job. So this case is also good to start with because there's so much research on this. There's no speculation here. This is modern, thorough, extensive documentation. There's just no question about any of this stuff. So how to make things better? Well, first, fixing the regulations, like changing that harvest period to be based on when is the fruit set, um, you know, cultivation is part of the solution. Ideally, we're going to move away from this industrialized monoculture, which pretty much happens in 3 states, which is Wisconsin, Illinois, and Ontario. Province, not a state. So there is what's called wild stimulated growing or woods grown ginseng, where you intentionally plant the plants in the wild and then you can watch them, right? You take care of them. You're not spraying fungicides on them and stuff, but you're making sure that they, are healthy stands. So basically mimicking what's done traditionally, but on a somewhat larger scale. So that seems like the better option to me. Admittedly, that's not going to be as productive. So the one solution is industrial monoculture, not a great solution. The better solution is this wild stimulated. And it is more expensive, but we're just so locked into buying the cheapest products. Like that's also part of the solution is, yeah, you pay more, but you get way more for your money. Like wild ginseng, it hasn't been studied for American ginseng, but for Asian ginseng, wild ginseng is way better than cultivated ginseng. There's way more of all the constituents we want. They're more active, all those things. So that's the kind of sad story. And then of course we can always substitute. So these two species, Oplopanax and Aurelia californica, are not under anywhere near the kind of pressure American ginseng is. Now, these could both become endangered easily. They both are wetland plants. That's the particular problem. Now, Oplopanax grows in a huge area, especially in British Columbia. There's vast tracts of British Columbia where there just aren't people. They're very remote. So this has a pretty large sustainable population. So I'm really not too worried about over harvesting Oplopanax. It is over harvested in Washington because there's way more people, but still in the national parks, we have a lot of national parks. There's a lot preserved there. Aurelia californica is a bigger issue because that grows in a much narrower area. It pretty much grows in Northern California, a little bit of Southern Oregon. So that is not the best solution in the world for this. But the other solution is harvesting the fruit instead of the root. There's tons of evidence that that's useful for Asian ginseng. There's a little bit for American ginseng, and it's probably true for Oplopanax because that would not destroy the whole plant, right? So that's that we might be seeing a change in the plant part to make it more sustainable. Questions about American ginseng? Okay, so Boswellia is in some ways a much bigger problem. I want to give the first caveat that I have no intention of depriving the people of East Africa or the Arabian Peninsula of their livelihood. That's not my intention here. It's not my intention to deprive people in Appalachia of their livelihood based on ginseng. It's to acknowledge there's problems and try to help local people to, to be able to do things sustainably. What often drives them to do things unsustainably are things they don't have control over. In the case of Boswellia, it's war. And local people aren't to blame for the wars that are happening in East Africa and the Arabian Peninsula. They're just trying to survive. But in the process, they're having a devastating effect on the Boswellia. But so are lots of other impacts. So we'll talk about how to get around this problem. So there's basically 6 species that are harvested in any significant amount of Boswellia, and they grow in somewhat different areas. They do have some chemical differences, but they're largely sold as interchangeable. And we're going to see that all of these species are in terrible, terrible trouble. There is no alternative species. Some are more widespread than others, and they're still, under enormous pressure. So a lot of this comes from this paper published in 2019, so very fresh and recent, very detailed, but also other research. So this is a great map showing where all 6 of these species grow. So the first thing you can see right off is that probably the most widespread species is the Boswellia serrata that grows in India. And that one is doing better, but it's still in trouble. But most of the supplies come from East African populations. So you can see this Papifera species and the more famous Boswellia sacra, which is also called Boswellia carteri. But you can see the harvesting of the East African species is way higher. And the really, really, really terrible problem is with the Boswellia sacra, that the most famous frankincense, both because it's a pretty limited area it grows in, and both these areas have just been in long-standing wars that have been absolutely devastating. Not so much from actually bombs blowing up the trees. It's more that people are made so desperate, right? They have limited access to food, medicine, etc. Many of them have no way to work, that one of the few income sources is to sell Boswellia. but that leads to over harvesting. It leads to people over tapping the trees. So this is when we're getting the resin. So naturally they produce some resin. They're called tears because it does kind of look like the tree is crying, but you can cut the bark and get more tears, and then the tree really is crying, right? There's significant harm, and you can tap a tree to the point that it dies. Like, it has to have this resin to live. It has some it can give up and be fine, but many trees are over tapped to the point of death. It's being compounded by some other factors. So anyway, that species, we're at the point of saying, right, well, that we should not be using the species. Now, the problem with that again is, well, then that is just going to make life more miserable for the local people. So we have to find a way to compensate for that, which I think is to help maintain sustainable population or sustainable harvesting by paying people way more for the product, right? Instead of what we always do, we extract the resource at a very cheap price, and then we make fancy products out of it. And that's when we boost up the price and make it profitable. So the money should flow to the local people. It should not flow to the rich, white, American, European processors, which is what happens right now. And I don't know how to fix that. I have an inkling. Now, you might say, well, wait a minute, Dr. Yarnell, you're such an alarmist. Come on, let's look at the red list. So this is a list maintained by the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, a great organization. So they maintain and do research on what is endangered and whatnot. Well, the problem with that is it's a small, underfunded organization. It's a nonprofit. And as you can see, for most of these species, they haven't done an assessment. So it's not on their list because they haven't had the resources to investigate it. That's going to change because this other research just came out. Here's the research showing that this is a catastrophe waiting to happen, that they are very gravely endangered, all these species. But this isn't how IUCN does their process. So this will probably change, but you can also see the last assessment of the most endangered species was done in 1998. Well, those data are no longer valid. Like, a lot has changed. The population has gone up, the climate catastrophe is way worse, the wars, et cetera, et cetera. So this is not a great resource. Yes, you should look at this resource. If you want to know if an herb's endangered, this is one place to start. You just Google IUCN Red List, go look it up. But if it's not there, you can't conclude it's fine. All you can conclude is no data. That's usually what you find out, is we don't know. But boy, if it's listed there, it's really bad because they're mostly capturing the worst case scenarios. So this is not near threatened. This is fully endangered at this point, because this is so out of date. So that paper I already mentioned that came out in 2019. So these researchers went out all around East Africa and all around, oh my gosh, the name of the country just flew right out of my head. The city is Aden that's there. It's the southern tip of the Arabian Peninsula. Oh my God. There's a terrible war going on. Why, mind? Why? Luckily, I've got the internet. Anyway, so they looked at a whole bunch of populations. This was not a small study. And in many different countries, many different places. And they consistently showed Yemen. That's what I'm looking for. In Yemen and East Africa. These researchers mostly were looking in East Africa. So you can see lots and lots of populations, thousands and thousands of trees. So they just went and counted how many trees are there, how many healthy, good trees are there, how many are damaged, how many are dying. They took tree ring data from a few hundred. So that is damaging the trees, right? You take a core into the tree. So that's why they didn't do too many of that. They built this sort of model based on their data. And so first, right off, they found that most of these populations, there were no juvenile trees. There were adult trees and so all the babies are dead. There's no babies. There's no generation coming up behind. All the seedlings, they don't exist practically. There's basically been no natural regeneration in most of these populations for decades. There is no new trees coming. So all the seedlings are dead from drought, from it being too hot, from grazing by animals, by humans, animals, right? Our domesticated animals, by war, by all sorts of influences. And so they're saying, yeah, in 20 years, the adults that are left, half of them are going to be gone. And that's just, I mean, so that's the ultimate catastrophe to the local people. It's like if the resource just completely goes away, then you have no income either. So it'd be a lot better to right now to figure out how to make this sustainable rather than waiting for the population to totally collapse, which right now we're on that trajectory. If anything, the sales are going up, production is going up. All these causes are getting worse. There's minimal awareness of this. We're just selling it like water at the Bastyr dispensaries. No one seems to care in the least, even though I've told them all that this is absolutely unacceptable and why. And it just, so we all say we have this mindset that we're, pro environmental and all this stuff, but our actions speak way louder than our words. Like, what are we actually doing? Well, this is one thing we're doing completely wrong, and it's really, really bad. So let's look specifically at Somalia in the Horn of Africa. So there's two main species growing there. So really, there is no country of Somalia. Somalia disintegrated in a civil war, which that's a vast oversimplification of what happened, because it also involves organizations and groups outside of Somalia who have impacted it. So there is no Somalia. So there's interestingly the most cohesive and effective part of Somalia is called Somaliland, which is at the very far north. If we look on this map, it's right where all of this diversity is. So this blow up map here in the right lower corner is Somaliland. So this is where most of the Boswellia sacra is. You can see it's where the only Boswellia freriana is, which is really, really critically endangered. And you've got Boswellia neglecta. So there's a huge diversity there. And there actually is basically a separate country of Somaliland. And no one recognizes it, but they function as a separate country. And it's the most centrally organized part of Somalia that's left. The rest is just warlords, and it's really pretty terrible. So there's some hope that because there is a kind of a functioning local government, that they're going to be able to fix things. But the problem is, since 2020, there's been basically no rain. For coming up on the third year, no rain. So of course the food crops are devastated. The wild trees are really, now Boswellia grows in a desert, like it's used to a desert climate, but this is, I mean, come on, there has to be some rain. So the drought is causing starvation. So then people are desperate to buy food because they can't grow it. So they need the income to buy food. There's not enough international aid to provide food. So another solution to this would be just provide enough food through international aid that people aren't starving and they're not so desperate for income, right? Like that. And there is some aid, but it's nowhere near enough. We've got to address the climate catastrophe. Like, why is there 5 rainy seasons that haven't happened and about to be a 6th? Climate catastrophe, hello. It's like This is not the fault of the people in Africa. This is our fault for driving cars and flying in airplanes and burning coal for electricity for hundreds of whatever, 100 years. Like, we caused this. It's our fault, and we're continuing it. And we're complicit. And I don't want to make you feel guilty. I just want us to be realistic. Like, that's the truth. It wasn't, yes, it was our ancestors, but it's us today, right now. And I'm doing it too. And there's reasons, like, we got to live our lives, but this is why it's a crisis, it's a catastrophe. We have to use that language to make us change. And again, this has to happen on a large scale. Just you getting an electric car isn't actually going to help that much. It needs to be that, like, everyone can do that. So lots and lots of terrible problems. I realize I'm almost at the end of my time, and I barely got the same story applies for all these herbs. So I'm glad I've gotten through these two examples. Now, hopefully, you all are aware that there was just a terrible war in Ethiopia. Thank God, it's basically, there's a negotiated settlement right now. There's not active fighting. So they are actually have become the largest exporter of frankincense, but the war was very detrimental. But there's lots of other problems in Ethiopia: deforestation, converting where the boswellia grows to grow crops or to raise animals. And there really is no plan in Ethiopia of how to protect the boswellia. There's also forest fire and wildfire problems in Ethiopia, climate catastrophe, hello. And again, there's lots of research showing there's so few adult trees and there's basically no juvenile trees. They are also seeing this problem of what's called a regeneration bottleneck. And also the genetic diversity of the species is going down, which makes them less resilient. So it's really this bad downward spiral. So again, the local people are not the problem. I'm not blaming them at all. We need to help them to be able to do what they want to do, which is to preserve this resource, to use it and preserve it. So if you want to help, buying boswellia supplements does not help. That causes more problems. You need to get involved with local people and with organizations that are trying to help cultivate this plant, helping local people have enough food. Do it, get involved if that's really what you want to fix it. And that might include lobbying our government to put pressure to say, and to provide resources to help develop a plan, to develop a management plan, to be able to support agriculture of the wild resource, all these different things. And we need to move the center of profit to where the plant grows, not in America and not in Europe. It needs to be in Africa, it needs to be in Arabia, it needs to be in Yemen. Like, we need to, if you're going to make extracts, and that should be done in country, not here, so that the profit flows to the producers. And boy, that does not happen. And right now, there is no sustainable boswellia. There's no cultivated source you can buy with any significant amount. There's one group that's growing it in Israel, but they just sell their own products. Anyway, this is the organization that is most actively trying to help. They're tiny, but if you want to get involved, that's probably the best direct way to do that. So we could have another 2 hours of these terrible stories. Oh, and there's great alternatives. This is the thing that drives me most nuts. We have wonderful, hyper abundant resinous plants in North America that have all the actions of boswellia. It's just there's not much research on them. So rightly, a lot of people say, yeah, but the research is on boswellia. I'm like, that's fine. Then let's do research on our plants and show that these are good alternatives to help take the pressure off. This is something we can actively do. And kudos to Aaron Donnie Clark for having heard me lecture about this and actually doing research on these herbs. So thanks, Aaron. I'm really glad I got through to one person. So we could go through, you'll look at the slides. Myrrh is just as big of a problem, etc. But I really mostly hope that you will be inspired to take some kind of action. talk to, at the very least, the last thing I want to say is how to talk to your supervisor. So your supervisor wants to prescribe Boswellia. So what doesn't work is to get angry and yell and make them feel defensive. And everyone's a human being, right? So I would definitely say that it is imperative that you say, I cannot be a part of that. This is an endangered species. I am not comfortable. I'm not willing to do that. Just like you wouldn't be willing to sell, I don't know, human eyeballs. Like, where did these eyeballs come from? Who is this? This is not acceptable. Like, there are things you can't, there are ethical lines you can't cross, and it has to get to that point. That gets the point across. Like, you can give it to them, but I'm not going to tell them to take it. I'm not going to prescribe it. I can't do it. And explain why. And here's the resource. You could give them my slides. Please give these slides to everyone in the world. I want everyone to know and to take action. So it's not, you're not judging them. You're not saying, I don't say you're a bad person. I'm just saying, I can't do this. You do what you want to do. And that makes a point, right? It makes it really clear. So, and I'm going to try to do what I can to see if we can actually make it so that can't be prescribed, and to promote the alternatives too. I didn't even cry or scream. I guess I'm so emotionally shut off from having yelled about it for so long. I'm burnt out. But hopefully you have some vim and vigor. Questions about anything?
Not a question, but I just want to say I think this is such an important topic, and definitely you bringing it up in classes helped because I first learned about the issues with Boswellia and pharmacognosy a couple years ago. And I think where I see it being used most on shifts is in combination products like BCQ and other like anti-inflammatory products. And if we could find alternative sources, and like I can't wait for the results of Aaron's study on pine to come out. Um, but we just need to start getting those alternatives in because this is definitely important to our medicine.
Well, thanks everyone. I'm off to teach my next class. It's been a crazy day, and I hope everyone has a good rest of the day. And yeah, good to see you all. Take
Yeah,
care.
thank you. That was helpful. Thank you.
You're very welcome. Good to see you.
Likewise.
Thank you so much.
Bye bye.